Hello everybody and welcome back to the CodeWrinkles channel for a new video. This time we'll talk about how to implement the repository pattern in an ASP.NET Core API application using, of course, Entity Framework Core. And this video builds upon what we did previously in another video where we got started with implementing Entity Framework Core in our API application. And in that video we talked about the DB context, migrations and so on. So if you want to check out that video, I will leave the link to it in the description, so just click on it and you can navigate to it and see exactly what we did there. The idea is that what I want to do right now is to build on top of that and actually try to improve our application by implementing this repository pattern. Now, before we get really started, I just want to say a very few things. First of all, if you search the internet about the repository pattern and how to use it, you will hear or read or listen to a lot of different opinions. And some of them say that, yeah, it's good to use the repository pattern. Some others say that, well, maybe that's not a good idea when you use Entity Framework Core. The idea is that from my point of view, these type of discussions are very opinionated and everybody is right in a certain point. So that's why my take on this is that if you're at a starting point of your career, it's okay to use it because it's one of the most widest used design patterns in all of software. And it's really okay and very good to get familiar with it. And the key here is, of course, that you need to play around with it. You really need to implement it. Maybe in your side projects, or probably you will also implement it on projects on which you work, maybe on your day-to-day work. But the idea is that while working with it, while gaining experience, while getting your hands dirty, you will actually experiment and see the pros and the cons of this design pattern by yourself. And in that case, you will come to the point where you better understand maybe that there are some scenarios where implementing a repository pattern might not be that useful, and while in other scenarios, implementing this repository pattern might actually be useful. So my take, once again, is if you're at the beginning stages of your career, then just use it because everybody uses it and you have to get familiar with it. And once again, while working, while getting your hands dirty, you will understand exactly what are the pros and what are the cons, and you'll then understand all the opinions that you read and or hear online. So let's get started with it. Right now what we see on the screen is actually our controller, our books controller, and we see that in the previous what we did in the previous video was to just add or inject the DB context, the app DB context it is called in our case, in our controller, and just use that context to get the data that we need in our API actions. And we'll try to actually improve our application right now and implement the repository pattern, and by the end I guess that we will understand what would be the main pros of using this repository pattern. So let's get started with it. First of all, we need to do a basic setup here. And we'll need a new folder that it will be called interfaces. And usually when you work on a real project, you would have a dedicated Visual Studio project for your domain layer. And in that case, the interfaces for the repositories should actually go there, not in the API itself or not in the MVC application where you probably will use the repositories in the controllers. So this is important to note. The interfaces are usually defined in the domain layer. And then in this dull folder that we have here, we'll add a subfolder that we will call repositories. And as you might guess, in the interfaces folder, we define the contracts for our repositories, in our case for our book repository, while here in this repositories folder, what we'll do the implementation, of course. So let's get started with the interfaces, and let's add a new class here. Of course, we'll choose interface, and our interface will be called iBook repository. And that should actually do it. Let's for now make it public. Okay, and based on the use case that we already have, if we go to our controller, we see that we actually have here three actions for get all books, get book by ID, and create a book. And these methods should be present or part of the contract definition that we do in our interface, because this is what consumers would actually expect from our repository to just get this type of information. So in this case, let's go back to this interfaces or to our interface, and let's try to define everything. So first of all, we'll use async and await. So this is why we'll always return a task of something. In this case, first of all, we'll return a task and we'll return a list of book. and it will be called get, with one T only, get all books. And let's also use this async at the end so that each consumer would exactly know that this is an async method. And let's also import our models folder. Then the next thing that we will need is simply get a task of book, so only get one book. But of course, it should be book, not gook, because it doesn't mean anything. This will be named get a book by ID. And here we will need also an ID. And of course, we'll use this async at the end, because also this method will be an async method. Virtually all the methods that we'll use right now will be async. And then last but not least, we'll need a way to create a book. And in this case, we just use the book, and we just return the book that we created in the repository or using that repository. And here it would be, or we'll call this create book async. And of course, here we'll need a book, because we need to know in the repository what book we should actually create. And that's actually it. There's not a lot more to it right now in this interface. That's what we actually need, and that's what we need to implement right now in our DAL layer. So let's go back to this repositories folder and add a new class here. And we'll, of course, name this class book repository. And of course, once again, this will implement the iBook repository interface. And we can simply use IntelliSense to just implement all the methods that we need. Of course, all of them right now, they throw a not implemented exception, but we'll get to them and we'll do some real work right there. Now, one thing that it is important to note right now, or to discuss right now, is that a repository is essentially working with the database. And this means that the repository will need to work with the DB context. Because as we said, the DB context is nothing else than the representation, the programmatic representation of your database in your application. Of course, by default, it doesn't contain any type of data unless you get it, but it just represents all your tables, relationships, constraints, and so on. So this is why each repository will actually need to work with the DB context. So in this case, we need to inject the DB context somehow in this repository. Now, the advantage of ASP.NET Core is that we have already added our AppDB context to our dependency injection container in startup.cs. We see here we have services at DB context. And this means that we can now virtually inject this AppDB context anywhere in the application where we need it, and ASP.NET Core will just provide it from its dependency injection container. So this is why we can simply create a constructor here. Of course, we'll need an associated private field to it. So let's make it private read-only, because we don't want to change anything to the DB context. It will be of type AppDB context, and let's name it CTX with underscore because it's a field, and that's how I usually name fields. And here, of course, we need as an incoming parameter, of course, the AppDB context once again, and it will be called CTX. And in the constructor, we'll just use it to assign to our private field. And right now we have the representation of our database in our book repository. So this means that we can actually right now start to implement all the methods that we need here. And the first one that we see here is create book async. And usually it's not recommended to do copy paste, but actually to keep this video as short as possible, here we can virtually go here and what is this create? We can really go here and take all this code part, because it's exactly the same thing that we want to implement in our book repository. And we see here, we say here, we paste it here. So first we add the new book. Of course, we need to make it async. Sorry for that. Okay, so right now we need to create a book. We get the book that we need to create. We add it to the context, and as said, when we add it to the context, it doesn't save it to the database. It actually just adds it to the DB context, and it is tracked from this point on by Entity Framework Core. But this doesn't do anything with the database itself. So only when we call save changes, this change is persisted to the database, And that's exactly when this book will also get an ID assigned from the database. So what we can do here is then simply return the book, because after this save changes is called, this book will have the ID that was generated by the database. So we can simply return it to the caller, and the caller might know what to do with it. In our case, we'll probably just return it to the client that just asked for that book to be created, so that it can be notified that the book was created, and it can also access it using the newly created ID. Then the next thing is we have this get all books async. So if we go back to the controller, this would be the first action that we used, and this would be just returning the books as a list. And yeah, let's go back to our books repository and implement this get all books async. Here that's really easy. We can just say return and await, and of course we need to mark this method as an async method also. And here we need to add using for Entity Framework Core. And right now that should do it. So this will return a list of books. Then one other thing that we need is to get the book by ID, and we can even in this case use this get book by ID, and what we need to return is actually this part. So we'll go back to the books repository and we do just that. So return and then await CTX books first or default async. It should return a task of book. Of course, we need to mark it as an async method as well. And right now everything should be okay. And before we go further, I just want to underline one other thing. This is a getting started video. So this is not an in-depth look on how or what features should a repository have. Because of course we will need to have here some logic that would handle errors, because maybe something goes wrong and it's not written to the database, or we can't read from the database. So we certainly need to implement error handling here in the repositories. We might even want to, well, try to implement logic for the transient error, like to retry to save that change or to get that information depending on what error do we receive and so on. So there are a lot of things that might come into a repository, but right now this is out of scope for this video. But if you subscribe to this channel, and this is a kind of invitation for you to subscribe to the CodeWrinkles channel, because we'll cover a lot more things about repositories and about Entity Framework Core with the time. So just check back here, because you might find some very useful information about deep technical information about how repositories are used, the best practices and so on. But right now we can go one step further, and the next thing that we need to do is just actually to implement or to add also our repository to this dependency injection container in ASP.NET Core. Because by doing this, we can simply inject it in all the controllers or wherever we need it in our application. So we will have services add scoped, and we'll add it as a scope service. And the way I usually do this, I just add scoped is a generic method, and we can provide here the interface. So it would be book repository, and we can then provide the implementation. So what is the class that actually implements this contract, this interface? And in my case, this would be my book repository. So let's add it. So what this means is actually that right now we have it ready and we can inject it wherever we need in our application. Right now we need it in our controller, and we actually don't need this app.db context anymore, but maybe we'll delete it later. Let's instead private read only, and we will need an book repository, and let's call it books. Of course, in this case, let's however delete it. Let's delete it to not get distracted by it, because we won't need the DB context anymore here, because we already have the DB context in the repository itself. So here I would have this iBook repository. Let's call it books, and here we just assign the incoming parameter to our private field. And right now, actually, what we would need to do here are very, very simple changes, because we don't need to use the context anymore. What we could do here, for instance, is simply use books. This is get all books. So we could simply use books and get all books async. This is what we need here. and that would return a list of books. Here we want to get a book by ID. In this case, once again, we don't need all this stuff anymore, and we can just return it. And here in this case it would be books. Sorry, I have to also type it correctly. Here to be get a book by ID async. And here we will have to pass in also the ID. But what we also need to do is await it. And we'll also need to await this one, because otherwise it would just return the task itself, and that wouldn't contain the information that we would actually expect. Now here, what we need to do is simply, well, we can also delete all of this because it's already done in the repository. So the only thing that we will need to do is await books and create book async, and we specify the book that we want to create. And that's actually it. So right now, if we run this application again, we should get the exact same results that we had previously, but in this case we have implemented the repository pattern. So right now we are actually using repositories to actually create books, and generally to get books by ID or the entire list of books. So let's start with the get books get all books. We just make a get request to API books, and that should return, I guess, all the information that we need. See that we have here right now 2 books with ID 1 and 2. Let's right now try maybe to post a book. And here in this body, I have already added something so that we don't write the JSON right now. So this would be a totally new book. And we see here that is 200 OK. And we see that this book has the ID 1002. So the book was added correctly and we got all the information that we need. And if we want to get the book by ID, let's see books, and let's get the book that we just created. It should be with this ID. And in this case, we just returned this single book. So everything works just fine. Now, before we wrap up this video, I just want to kind of discuss a little bit what are the benefits that we can see here right now. Now, imagine that, so we previously had the DB context here in this controller. Now, imagine that we would need to work with books in other parts of the application as well. Maybe we have a logging service, or maybe we have some classes where we do some business logic where we will need books, or to get books from the database. This means that basically wherever we would need to work with books, we would have to inject that appdb context. So this was the scenario that we had before we implemented the repository pattern. Now imagine that at a certain point you might want maybe to change the database behind it, or something changes to your DB context. But in that case, you will have to find literally all the places where you have used that DB context and do changes, because probably when you do changes, or when you add changes to the DB context, most probably parts of your logic that you implement will break. So your solution will not build anymore, there will be a lot of bugs, and so on. So this is really, of course, not optimal at all. But right now, in this setup that we have with this repository, whenever we want to change something to the DB context itself, the actual thing that we need to change is only the implementation of the books controller, of the book repository. Because we just need to make the changes here in this place, of course, as long as the interface remains the same. If the interface changes, so if, I don't know, if I change some of these methods, like this will not return a list, but I don't know, it would return a book array or something like that, then of course we will probably need to do changes also in code where we use this repository. But for a lot of other changes, you would actually have or maintain the exact same contract, because that's the idea of an interface. And this means that the only place where you need to do changes if you change something to your DB context would be in that specific repository. And this is of a great benefit because, well, it creates some more loose coupling between classes here. It makes this repository easier to test, because previously, if we wanted to test our controller methods, it would have meant that we would also have to test right there our data access layer. And of course, this is not optimal. In that part, we just want to test if the methods, if the actions return the actual results that we need, the status code and the objects and so on. So we don't want really unit test the database or the data access layer from our UI, in this case from our controllers. And in this case, having this repository, you can unit test this repository by its own and test the controller, of course, only for the HTTP status codes and results that it generates. So this is another very important thing that we have achieved using or implementing this repository pattern with Entity Framework Core in this very, very simple ASP.NET Core API application. And that being said, I guess we're done with this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, then please don't be shy and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to add something, just don't be shy again and use the comment section. It's very important. I really try to answer to all the comments, and I'm very happy when I see that people get interested in the things that we create together, and when there are questions or concerns or things that needs to be discussed, I'm really happy about it, and I'm always answering all the questions that arise, and I'm really intrigued by, or I'm happy with all discussions that are generated here in the comments of these videos. So once again, thank you very much, and till the next time, I wish you a very good day.